All right, welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're diving into an event that literally redefines what the human body, and honestly the human spirit, are capable of. We're talking about the unbelievable true story of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. You probably know it as the Miracle of the Andes. So let's just dive right in.
72. I want you to just sit with that number for a second. That is the number of days the survivors of this crash spent trapped in the freezing, absolutely unforgiving peaks of the Andes Mountains. I mean, think about what you've done over the last 2.5 months. Now try to imagine spending that exact same amount of time fighting for your life every single minute. You're surrounded by deadly cold, and you have absolutely no certainty that anyone is ever going to come looking for you. It's a number that's almost impossible to really wrap your head around, but it completely anchors everything we're going to explore today.
So to understand how this whole tragedy began, we've got to rewind to October 13th, 1972. There were 45 people on board this aircraft. And, this wasn't just some random group of strangers commuting. This was a rugby team traveling from Uruguay to Chile for a match. They had their friends, family members, and the flight crew with them. The mood inside the cabin? It was exactly what you'd expect for a sports trip. Upbeat, super exciting, people were laughing, some were just dozing off, and others were looking out the windows at those massive mountain views below. But nobody inside that cabin had a clue that the terrible weather conditions outside, we're talking dense cloud cover, practically zero visibility, were setting the stage for a catastrophic navigation mistake. The pilots honestly believed they had already crossed the Andes, but in reality, they were flying right into the heart of them.
Then, at around 3:30 p.m., the calm completely shattered. Out of nowhere, the plane hit heavy turbulence, just violently shaking the passengers. Fear instantly took over. And then, the absolute worst-case scenario. The pilots suddenly saw giant, snow-covered mountains looming directly in front of their windshield. They desperately pulled the aircraft higher, trying to clear the peaks, but it was just too late. The plane's wings slammed brutally into the mountain. Within seconds, the second wing broke apart. Passengers were screaming, and then the entire tail section of the aircraft ripped away, throwing several people straight out of the plane into the freezing air. What was left of the main fuselage basically turned into a missile, sliding across the snow-covered mountains before finally crashing deep inside the Andes.
So we instantly dropped from 45 laughing, excited passengers down to 33. The initial crash was just horrifying. Several people were killed on impact, while a lot of others suffered broken bones, traumatic head injuries, and severe wounds. When that twisted metal finally came to a stop in the snow, only 33 people had actually survived the initial impact. But as devastating as that loss of life was, for those 33 survivors, the nightmare definitely hadn't ended with the crash. Actually, it had really only just begun.
These survivors suddenly found themselves trapped at nearly 12,000 feet above sea level. They are completely surrounded by endless snow and deadly cold. And remember, these are people packed for a quick trip and a rugby match. They didn't have proper winter clothing, they had no survival gear, and absolutely zero food rations. At night, the temperatures up in the high Andes dropped far, far below freezing. To avoid freezing to death in the pitch black, the injured, terrified survivors literally had to huddle together inside the shattered, open remains of the plane. They just used whatever body heat they had left to make it to the next morning.
Now, for the first few days, they clung to the one thing that keeps any of us going in a disaster: hope, right? They waited for rescue teams. They knew aircraft were out there searching the mountains from the sky, but there was a massive problem. The roof of their plane was white, so it blended in perfectly with the endless snow. Searchers literally couldn't spot the wreckage. And then came the absolute most heartbreaking moment. Through this tiny battery-powered radio they had somehow managed to get working, they heard a news broadcast that just delivered a completely devastating blow. The official search operation had been stopped.
Think about that contrast for a second. The rest of the world officially gave up. They assumed the crash was fatal, closed the book, and moved on. But the horrifying truth was that these people were very much alive. Hearing that radio broadcast made the survivors realize one terrifying, undeniable reality. Nobody was coming to save them. They were still freezing, still suffering at 12,000 feet, but now they were entirely on their own.
Which brings us to a question that kind of forces us to step into their frozen shoes. What would you do when the food completely runs out? As the days agonizingly dragged on, the total lack of food turned into a critical emergency. The survivors were getting dangerously weak. Desperate to just put anything in their stomachs, they started trying to eat whatever they could scavenge from the wreckage. We're talking strips of leather from luggage. They tried eating the cotton out of the seats. They even tried eating toothpaste. But obviously none of this worked. And slowly the mountain began claiming more lives as people started dying from sheer starvation and the relentless cold.
They were backed into an impossible corner, pushed absolutely beyond human limits by starvation.
they made the most difficult decision of their lives. To survive, they decided to eat the bodies of the dead passengers. Now, the source material points out that at first, many of the survivors outright refused. I mean, of course they did. But as the starvation worsened and death became completely imminent, they realized they had been pushed to the absolute brink. They truly believed that consuming the remains of their deceased friends and family was literally the only way to sustain their own lives. It was just an unimaginable choice, made under unimaginably desperate circumstances.
And just when you think they had made this harrowing adaptation to stay alive and things literally couldn't get worse, the mountain dealt them another devastating blow. Weeks passed in this kind of frozen purgatory, and then disaster struck again. One night, a massive avalanche crashed directly into the plane wreckage. The rushing snow actually buried the survivors alive inside the fuselage while they were sleeping in the pitch dark. Several more people suffocated and died that night. So not only did the avalanche claim more lives, but it massively escalated that feeling of absolute despair. Now they were trapped inside a metal tube, buried under tons of snow.
The mountain's toll was just mathematically terrifying. Look at the numbers. They started with 45 passengers, only 33 survived that initial crash. And as the days bled on, through exposure, starvation, injuries, and then that avalanche, the number just kept shrinking. Ultimately, only 16 would make it out. It became incredibly obvious that if they just stayed at the wreckage waiting, it was a mathematical certainty that the number of survivors would eventually hit zero.
Knowing this, they realized they had to take matters into their own hands. After being trapped in the mountains for over 2 months, 2 survivors made the ultimate pivot toward hope. Fernando Parrado and Roberto Canessa just refused to give up. They decided they were going to leave the relative shelter of the wreckage and go search for help themselves. Now let's be clear, this wasn't some calculated hiking expedition. They were stepping out into a frozen wasteland without proper mountain equipment, no ropes, and no warm clothes. They were essentially walking into the absolute unknown, betting their very lives on finding a way out.
Let's track that journey. Day 1 was all about leaving the wreckage behind. Then, for days 2 through 9, Parrado and Canessa climbed through deadly snow, jagged rocks, and these punishing, freezing winds. And remember, they were incredibly weak from over 2 months of starvation and exposure. Every single step they took across those treacherous peaks could have easily killed them, but they just kept walking. Finally, on day 10, an incredible breakthrough. They reached the other side of the mountains, where the snow finally broke, and they stumbled upon a Chilean shepherd. Against all odds, they had done the impossible.
Because of their incredible 10-day trek, rescue helicopters were finally dispatched. After 72 brutal days trapped in the Andes, 16 people were ultimately rescued alive, while 29 lost their lives in the tragedy. When the news finally broke, the story completely shocked the entire world. People just could not comprehend how these 16 individuals managed to stay alive for over 2 months in freezing, totally hostile mountains. And while the source notes that some folks at the time criticized their desperate survival methods, specifically the decision to consume human flesh, the overwhelming response from the global public was just absolute shock and awe at their physical and mental endurance. Which leads us directly to how this event is remembered today. Many have called it the greatest survival miracle in history. Even decades later, Flight 571 remains one of the most unbelievable true stories ever recorded. It's a story completely defined by intense fear, unimaginable physical and emotional pain, profound sacrifice, and above all, the absolute, unstoppable human will to survive against completely impossible odds. It basically proves that the human drive to live can push people far, far beyond the limits of what we think is scientifically or psychologically possible. So, as we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. We all like to think we know who we are, right? We think we know what we're capable of, but looking at the unimaginable ordeal of the survivors of Flight 571 forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. What are the true limits of your own willpower, and what would you actually sacrifice to live? It's a fascinating and honestly pretty sobering thought to end on. Thank you so much for joining me today as we unpack this incredible source material. I hope this gave you a clear, structured understanding of the miracle of the Andes. Keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.